Hey everyone, so today I will be arguing in favor of the UN double standard, the United Nations unfair treatment of Israel. This is for POS 465, international organizations and law. So to provide a little bit of context, the United Nations established the State of Israel in 1947 with UN Resolution 181. You can see kind of the map drawing right here. And as Al Jazeera notes, this plan was never implemented on the ground, kind of served as an ideal. Israel was formed out of the partition of the British Mandate Palestine, which created Jewish and Arab state respectively. Israel subsequently declared independence in 1948 and shortly became a member state of the UN, the international organization. And so with that, who is the democracy in the Middle East? Right now, the only democracy is Israel. In the Middle East, this is kind of a contentious area for democracies to exist, and kind of it serves as an example for that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about so-called human rights violations. And Israel is often criticized, especially by the United Nations, for kind of so-called human rights violations. Israel is a nation constantly under attack from different groups that seek to undermine the state. They wish for it to not to exist. And what is seen as human rights violations, and what I see, is that they're responding to this. And I think it is the responsibility of any nation to respond to protect and defend its citizens. And just to kind of put this into perspective, North Korea, which we know to be one of the most repressive regimes on the face of the planet, only received one resolution from the UN to condemn its human rights in 2020, just one. And we know this to be an authoritarian state. People there have no rights. There's no real idea of human rights. And in Israel, there have been 17 resolutions from the UN, 17 resolutions from the UN to condemn human rights violations in 2020. In Israel, we know to be a democratic state where people do enjoy lots of freedom, lots of rights. Maybe not so much as in the US, but definitely compared to North Korea. And so you can kind of see the stark contrast in the way that UN responding to these different nations. And it leads one to believe that there is some bias present here. And so the truth about Israel. So Israel has open elections, free speech, religious tolerance, a free press, an independent judiciary. Now that is key. An independent judiciary is very uncommon. It is a trading partner of the world, and 1/5 of its citizens are Muslim. And they live there freely and enjoy the same rights and are even represented in government and in the press. And so can the same be said of surrounding nations? Not to the same extent, and for many, not at all. And so I think that kind of really illuminates, especially if you're comparing it to North Korea, where they only received one condemnation from this international organization. And so I think it's relevant to bring up Hamas and Israel. So here's kind of the basic cycle that happens probably once a year. Hamas fires rockets in Israel, an act of aggression, no doubt. So Israel has two choices. Israel can do nothing. It has a technology of defending itself, the Iron Dome, but Israeli citizens will be ordered to stay in bomb shelters until Hamas decides to stop. Or two, Israel responds, protect its citizens, but it does risk harming Palestinian civilians, among others. Though this is unintentional, Israel has historically taken steps to limit civilian casualties. And then on the international scene, who is wrong, Hamas or Israel? So we have an inevitable moral trap here. When Israel does respond, it's seen as the bully. And so the UN blames Israel. But we know that Israel is not the aggressor. They are just responding to aggression. And so this kind of, they're put in a bad position. And a lot of the times the media, the United Nations, and a lot of groups that don't want Israel to exist use this narrative against them. And I think it's dangerous and unfair. Israel is not an apartheid state. An apartheid state is one that has an intent to maintain domination by one radical group over another, or the systemic oppression of one radical group over another. And this is done through pretty inhumane acts. I don't think it is fair to classify Israel an apartheid state. I think Israel can be fairly criticized as a nation. But when you call something that is not an apartheid, it takes away from true apartheid states where inhumane acts, human rights violations are actually occurring. And so by making this unfair jump to apartheid, it takes away from the gravity, the weight of that word and that definition. And so in conclusion, the UN has unfairly treated Israel, and as a result fails to act against real and tangible threats to human rights around the globe. You have countries like Russia, China, Eritrea, Somalia sitting on the Human Rights Council of the UN, which we know, especially recently with Russia and Ukraine, has committed atrocious human rights violations. Yet they are deciding who are the real perpetrators of that. And so I think there's an unequal balance there too. So I hope that all makes sense, and I look forward to your rebuttal.